big part of the fun with Dungeons and Dragons is the math of the game, the player characters and the monsters going at it together. When the math works really well, it's easier to tell a great story, even if challenge isn't your goal. So it's very important how the monster manual for 2025 for the 2024 edition compares to 2014. And that's what we're doing in this video. We're going to look at hard math, the actual numbers that I've crunched from all the monsters in the 2025 monster manual. Get ready. So let's talk about why challenge matters. I love a game where I just can sit back and listen to the players talk to one another in character and scheme, or they surprise me with wild ideas, where the encounter could be, let's say, for level 20 D&D characters, and yet, even though they blow it away, it's super awesome, and the players say, that was incredible, that was so much fun, right? So a good game doesn't just rest on challenge, right? There are all these other aspects to it, but challenge does matter. And the reason it does is because it has the foundation of some games, some role-playing games have this foundation where math is driving a reward structure both for player and DM and the interaction between them. So the player is creating a character and they're making choices that will make them feel great, right? If everything is always just really easy, then doing things as a player doesn't feel like you're accomplishing much, right? There's no resistance from the game. It doesn't really matter what you do. And that's great when you're playing like story games where you may not even have character stats, right? It doesn't matter. You're just telling a story together and that's super fun. But when you want to, beat the trap or jump over the pit or stab the monster, having it be a little hard is what makes it fun. And the game has to decide, as the designers are making it, what that math looks like, the intersection between the player capabilities and the monsters. And those foes, if they're not challenging enough, if they consistently let you down, you will have problems and you'll need to compensate if you're trying to attain that, right? So challenge is super important in setting that baseline for the game that makes for a really fun experience. And then you have all that other stuff that makes it super cool. The story, the role-playing, the neat concepts going on in encounter, right? And we can think of challenge as sort of an intersection. One is for sure the monsters, right? When these guys in this monster manual show up, if they do what they're supposed to, that is one part of the equation, right? So let's say I've got a Behir. So this cool Behir is, let's say it's really neatly designed and it's doing all kinds of cool stuff. It's lightning breath, its ability to constrict and chomp you. Maybe it swallows you and claws at you. If that is scary when it hits you, that's really cool. So that is the monster side of things. The players have their character side of things, right? So the intersection of characters and monsters. The characters in 2025 D&D, or 2024 D&D, have become more powerful, right? So how that intersects is really interesting. But there's more. How many monsters they can face and at what levels they can face them has to do with encounter design. So what level can you be to face a Behir all by itself? And does that feel like a good fight? Both because of what the monster's like, what the character's like, but also that I chose to present that mix, right? Or could I have the Behir surrounded by goblins? Would that be good? Or surrounded by mages who are casting a spell. Maybe they just summoned it, and those mages have like fireball spells and stuff like that, right? Big difference between goblins or mages. So the encounter design system is what tells us whether the heroes at a certain level can face this alone, face it with goblins, or face it with mages, and that's an entirely different situation. So the challenge intersection is the characters, the monsters, the encounter design at a bare minimum, right? That is the key of this intersection. On top of that, we can layer some other things. We can layer the encounter design at a larger scale. So did I put in this room or area where the scene where it's taking place, a field of lightning that goes off every now and then, cutting off different combatants? And by the way, the Behir is immune to that. That totally changes the challenge, right? Are there fields of lava? Is there elevated areas that the Behir can easily traverse because it has a climb speed, and the characters may not, right? That all changes things up, right? So there's this terrain situation, the size of the room. Do they start 100 feet away? All those kinds of things. And then there is what you are like as a DM. Are you super tactical? Do you see monster stat blocks and immediately go, oh, I know what I can do with this, or this will pair well with this other monster? The more that you as a DM can do that, the challenge will go up because you have that capability to sort of play Dungeons and Dragons chess in addition to the story stuff and all the other cool things. So that's the challenge intersection and plays a big part in what we're gonna talk about today. We're gonna look at the monster side of things, but I want to make sure it's understood that all of this dovetails into one another, right? It's all really important and intersects. And in 2025, the 2025 Monster Manual deals with 2024 changes to both characters and encounter design. You can see my video on encounter design where I talked about those changes, where everything kind of moved one column over on the hard scale. So the Behir can show up sooner at a lower level, let's say, for the party. You can have a Behir sooner than you would have with 2014 math. All right, that's the 2024 truth. If the Behir is also harder, we've got some interesting things. And if the characters are stronger, which we suspect they are, then lots of things are changing, right? At least 3 things, even if you, the DM, and the encounter design stay stable. One last thing I want to talk about is math heroes. So there are a couple of math heroes here. One is the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. In that book, it provided instructions on how to create a monster. And those instructions included a table that showed what you can expect at each challenge rating. So for every CR, it would tell you, here's the attack bonus, here's the hit point range, the damage range. And that helped us know as a benchmark what to go against. Now, Wizards of the Coast actually used their own math for how they created things, but we could still compare what they had published against this 2014 DMG and sometimes conclude, at least I certainly did, the 2014 DMG is sort of better than the published versions, right? Like that, I like the math of the DMG better. And if you were cool enough to pick up the book Forge of Foes, then you have our cool tables that we have in here that show you what you can do to hit challenge levels for all kinds of different scenarios. So you get all kinds of neat tables that are super helpful. And this is available, please, if you haven't picked it up. All of this work is that we did in Forge of Foes comes from 2 other math heroes that have really worked on the math of the game a lot. One is the Blog of Holding, where Paul has done all kinds of number crunching, taking things like the original 2014 Monster Manual and taking the Volos and Mordenkainen source books that came out with monsters, putting those in. Tom Dunn, who's done all sorts of breakdowns of the math of the game, fascinating level. Take a look at his blog. We mention it on Mastering Dungeons podcast all the time. And he has broken down the math. In fact, very recently he's broken it down. I'm still looking at what he has and comparing that to what Blog of Holding has created. But those kinds of math heroes have made it possible for us to analyze the math of this. And that's the kind of work I'm trying to do. I'm trying to honor those folks who came before me and lift up on their shoulders a bit to create a video like this where I crunch some numbers. And in the future, Tom and I have been talking. Tom Dunn and I will be sharing. I'll share once I can. We're out of this NDA period. I will share my data with him, as well as I will put the data into the adventure tools that I make available to Patreon folks so that you can see the averages that are out there and work with them and use them in your design. Let me share with you my process so you understand how I went about creating this data set. Wizards of the Coast allowed us to share some things, including this ancient gold dragon, which they have shared previously. So you can see the stat block for this CR24 creature and how complex it is. So what I did was take a look at this and every single monster in the advanced copy of the Monster Manual for 2025. And easy things are, I jot down, okay, the name, Ancient Gold Dragon, it has an AC of 22, hit points, its initiative score, whether it has immunities, vulnerabilities, resistances. So some of that is just really easy, jotting that down. But then you get into the interesting things like how do you track its DPR, its damage per round, right? I also wanted to track some things like multi-attack. How many does it tend to have do monsters tend to have at certain levels? So here I wanted to note the Ancient Gold Dragon has 3 attacks in its multi-attack, and keep a track of that so I can see, is that more than expected, less, which is helpful to see. So if you look at this stat block, you can see there's a lot here, and this is not one of the bigger ones. It's larger than most, but there are bigger full-page stat blocks in the book. It has a multi-attack. So first of all, its traits are non-damaging, so we just ignore them. Second thing I should say is that on the various videos, Wizards of the Coast designers have been saying that they really worked so that every path leads to the same CR. Meaning there aren't, as in 2014, monsters that say have a ranged weapon that's meant to be flavor or color for it, or just a sort of thing it can do, but that it wouldn't use it. And so it would be very low damage, right? Here they've tried to make every path lead to an output that is equivalent for what you'd expect in the CR range, whatever that may be, since they didn't share that with us. So in this case, we can expect that if there is a non-damaging option or a damage that's an option that's a little lower, we can ignore that if there is another one we can go with instead, because they're theoretically equivalent. Does that make sense? So if you had a ranged attack and a melee attack, and the ranged is 5 points of damage less but knocks you prone, that should be Wizards saying that that prone is worth the 5 damage. That makes sense? So I can use the higher damaging one and ignore the prone one, because that should give me the same math. I hope that makes sense. So in this case, let's take a look at it. It's got a multi-attack where it can do 3 rend attacks, and then it gets complicated. It can replace one attack, one of those rends, with a use of either A, spellcasting to cast Guiding Bolt at level 4, or use it to Weakening Breath. And if we look at Weakening Breath, it is an area of effect, which is really cool, 90-foot cone, but what it does is give you disadvantage and lower your damage. Tactically, that's awesome, but I'm going to ignore that because it doesn't add to damage. So for my damage calculations, I'm not looking at Weakening Breath, because in theory, it is one of the paths to getting a CR output, but I don't have to use all paths, right? They should be equivalent. So in this case, the real question is whether Guiding Bolt does more damage than my rend. And so when I looked at the math, I broke out what is Guiding Bolt on average doing and whether rend is better, right? And rend does 19 slashing damage plus 9 fire, so it is 28 damage. So I forget in this particular example which one was better. I think the rend was better. So in that case, I said, okay, in a normal round, it's doing 28 times 3 because it's doing 3 rend attacks. But then we've got the Fire Breath. So the Fire Breath, its breath weapon, recharges 5 to 6. Monsters are generally, DPR is calculated across 3 rounds. And that's worth understanding. Truthfully, it depends on how you DM, right? I almost never go 3 rounds. In fact, even ending in 4 is a little rare. And something like an Ancient Gold Dragon, I'm going to have so much fun stuff going on in the encounter, like goals to save somebody or a ritual you have to stop or something else. There's no way that monster is only lasting 3 or 4 rounds. It's probably going more like 6 because it would be an epic fight. Be that as it may, the rule for this kind of work is that Dungeons & Dragons uses is 3 rounds. So we're assuming it lives 3 rounds. When I recharge as 5 to 6, that means it's going to get used once on average. So it's easy. You can say a third of the time, right? It will do this cone in a 90-foot cone. It will do 71 damage to each target. So I will factor that in for a third of the time. That's what's happening. And then if all I did was rend the rest of the multi-attack, then it would be 2/3 of the time I would be doing my 28 times 3. Hope this makes sense. I'm not overwhelming you too much in math, but that's how I'm calculating. Now, in this case, we also have spellcasting. I could look at spellcasting and see whether that should be an option. And we have Flame Strike at level 6. Flame Strike has a smaller area of effect, but it does some pretty nice damage. So that's where I look at like, okay, I could do Rend, Fire Breath, Flame Strike, and I have to run the math and say, what does level 6 Flame Strike do? Is that better than my multi-attack with 3 Rens, right? Once I've done that, I've got my 3-round breakdown. I then look at the legendary actions, which are additional to that 3-round breakdown of what you did. And the legendary actions have Banish, which deals damage, but it has a statement you can only use it once. So that's one of my 3. By the way, you can do 4 in layer, but I went with the non-layer math here. So in theory, in layer, all your legendary monsters will hit a little bigger than my math that you see. Guiding Bolt, so they can cast Guiding Bolt at level 4, or they can Pounce, which is essentially a rend. So in this case, you're going to do Banish once and probably rend twice. That's your 3 legendaries, and that's all additional damage. I'm not dividing it up or anything like that because it's being done each round. And there you have it. That will give us our DPR calculation, right? And actually, let me go ahead and just share, because the Ancient Gold Dragon is data that's publicly out there. I can look at actually what it looks like in my spreadsheet. So I have a spreadsheet full of all the monsters in the monster manual, which I cannot share at this time, and there'll be constraints to what I can share in the future. But you can see the Ancient Gold Dragon. I'm tracking its size, its CR, it has immunities, its armor class. And here I do a couple things. I look at the damage of just its basic sort of attack that it does. So its multi-attack is 3 Rens. So that's 3 times 28 is 84. And then I look at its average DPR. So here's how I can calculate it based on what I talked about before. You've got 3 times the 28 Rend. It's going to do that 2/3 of the time. It's going to do the breath weapon, which does 71 damage 4 times, assuming 4 targets, sorry. It's going to do that 1/3 of the time. And then it's going to do the legendary actions, 24, which is, I think, that's the Banish, and then the 2 Rens, right? So that's how I calculate what your average per round damage will be for an Ancient Gold Dragon, which is 230.67. Now, what I did here, it's very important, gets into the topic of area of effect. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a second, but I just want to point out I used 4 targets here. And here I did this column tracks the 2 target average. So if I assume only 2 targets, then I get a much lower 183 damage per round. I also tracked the save DC. And if it was a spell, actually, DC versus some other ability, I track that separately just in case I need that someday. And then lastly, does it have bonus actions, reactions, and legendary actions? And then I kind of churn it all down to look at an analysis for that CR. An interesting thing for CR24 is I only have the Ancient Gold Dragon to look at. So it's only one, a data sample size of 1, right? So I don't know how theoretically representative this is of what the CR should be. I can only look at the Ancient Gold Dragon and see how its numbers look. But as we'll do in a second, we can compare that to, more in a second, we can compare that to many other things we have already for previous math and draw conclusions from that. But let's go back and talk about area of effect a second. So this may be a little boring for some of you. If you just want the answers, feel free to skip ahead to the section where I break down the results. But for those of you who want to know how I went about this, and it's interesting to you from a design perspective, from an understanding of the game, then here we go. So I looked at this idea. I was looking at specifically this Ancient Gold Dragon, right? It is breathing a 90-foot cone, and it's a flying creature, and it's super smart. And I'm usually going to put it in a situation that favors it, right? Like its lair, or it has prepared an ambush. I mean, it's a gold dragon. It's not going to be dumb. Any big dragon is going to sort of pick its fight spot, right? So the idea that this huge thing would swoop in, and I've got a couple of sweet gold dragon minis. The idea that this thing is going to swoop in and breathe fire on you and get 2 targets in a 90-foot cone just seems wild to me. And so I went to look and see, well, what else can we draw upon to maybe draw some conclusions? By the way, I did reach out to Wizards of the Coast and ask staff, do they still use the 2 target as their design goal, or their design math? And And yes, they do. Just as in 2014, they assume all area effect hits 2 targets. In case you didn't already know this, other assumptions that are always made in 2014 that I did not verify, an attack always hits, a saving throw always fails. And that's how that DPR is calculated. So if you saw the calculations before and thought, well, why isn't there a probability of hitting? Because that's not something that's actually used in the math of it to sort of compare everything. There are lots of reasons for that. I won't go into that level of geekery, but just so you know. All right, so I went and looked at the 2024 rules to see, do they tell me anything about what I can expect to hit with area of effect? And they actually kind of don't. The only thing they do is have rules for mass combat, but that assumption is everything's really packed in, right? So they're saying like a 60-foot cone can get 16 targets. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's because it's a horde of skeletons or something, and you, the character, are attacking them. So that didn't super work, but I looked at it and I thought it was interesting. Then in the 2014 DMG on page 249, there is something about adjudicating areas of effect. And this is pretty useful because this is more about the idea of sort of theater of the mind and the idea that, well, if it's a cone, it's going to hit about the size of the cone divided by 10, or if it's a cylinder, radius divided by 5, and so on. So I then did some math for various sizes to see, well, what does that actually get to? And I crunched through various numbers and thought through it and analyzed it. And in the end, I came up with this little table you see here, where if it's a cone, a 15-foot cone probably hits 2 targets, 30-foot 3, 60-foot 4. And then I stopped because, well, there might just be 3 characters in the party, though often there are 4. But are there 5? Are there 6? So I decided to cap it at 4. And in speaking with other designers and on our Discord, Patreon Discord, this felt like probably a good cap. You know, let's not go all the way from the default assumption of 2 and go to, 5 or 6. Let's go to 4 as the maximum. And so we reach those maximums fairly quickly. The cube is similar, a 30-foot cube, a 20-foot cube. Those probably can hit 4 targets. If you think of casting Thunderwave, right? Like, I hardly ever see a player use Thunderwave on just 2 targets. They're probably getting 3 in that 15-foot cube. It's debatable, of course, but that to me sounds like a better number. A line is tricky. Sometimes the lines are 5 feet wide, and so there's a limit to how many targets you can get. So generally, I capped it at 3 targets, but a 90-foot line is often being cast by a pretty strategic creature. It's a dragon, it's a lich casting lightning bolt, something like that. You're probably getting 3 targets in there. Spheres are tricky, and also emanations. There are a lot more monsters that now use what's called an emanation in the 2024 rules, so it just spreads out of you. There are some monsters in this book that have like a 100-foot or bigger emanation. Yeah, you're getting everybody, right? And so I generally went with 2 targets in a 5-foot sphere or emanation. So think of something that radiates, a fire elemental radiating fire. How many things would be essentially adjacent to it? Probably 2, probably. 20-foot, where we're talking about fireball. You could make an argument for 3 targets. I went with 4. I feel like in the combats that I run across all these tables at conventions and homes, 4 is a more common target that's getting in those spaces than it is 3 from the monster side. And again, you're often using these abilities once in 3 rounds. The monster will generally pick an effective round to use that, say, fireball, and will probably get 4 targets instead of 3. So I went with 4. That one's an arguable one. You can always run your own numbers. But that's what I went with. So now you understand kind of what I looked at with area of effect. Instead of assuming 2 targets, everywhere you see a number that isn't 2, that's something that I decided to change because I think it's more realistic. There are many arguments you could make. Like you could say like, well, the number 2 is because some people make their saving throws, or because sometimes, I don't know, some other factor happens that mitigates the... I hear you, but our assumption of 2014 or 2024 is attacks always hit and saving throws always fail. So, I just feel like it makes sense to use damage that's a little more representative. So going back to what I've tracked, when you look at this ancient gold dragon, that's why you see those 2 columns here, the damage or the average DPR and the 2-turn damage. What those are doing for you is saying that difference of if I really get those 4 targets in my huge cone, then that DPR is 230.67. If I'm not, if I'm only hitting the 2 targets that the design team uses, then it's 183. So a lot of geekery, but I hope this helps you really grasp the granularity of calculating all these numbers. And we should probably get to those. Ooh, one more thing I got to cover. There are additional constraints that make it tough to make these calculations. Spells, for example. In addition to just the area of effect angle of them, a lot of spells are pretty wild, right? So, for example, Cloud Kill. It shows up and it does damage. Will a target stay in the area of effect to take damage twice? So should I double the damage? Well, some targets are going to move out, but how many? Boy, and it compounds that whole target number question, right? Cloud Kill also drifts, and that drift can mean that it drifts away from the things it's trying to the targets it's trying to damage, or towards them. So what do you do with Cloud Kill, right? So sometimes I had to make assumptions when the spell was the most damaging or a good damaging option out of those 3 rounds. I had to think through how would those work. And some monster features are like that too, right? So like, our Remorhaz, when it swallows a target, should that swallow damage being inside with the stomach acid or the heat or whatever it is, should that be 1 round? Multiple rounds? Is it going to swallow multiple creatures? There's a lot there that just, math is hard. Those assumptions are hard. And I did my best estimate based on my play experience to calculate that out. So again, these numbers are the best I can. I also went through the numbers a couple of times, but there are always going to be some errors in my transcription. And that's just unavoidable. But hopefully those, as I share this data with, say, Tom Dunn, we'll find those and it'll get better and better as a data set. All right, so here it is. We're going to look at the numbers pulled together across all the monsters in the monster manual. I can share this because this does not show off individual stat blocks of things that aren't public or in the SRD. This is the overall math of the game, and we're going to take a look at it. And there are some important things to look. So let me explain what this screen is that you're looking at. So on the left side is the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. The numbers that it references and says, hey, here's what monsters should be like, right? A CR0 monster should have between 1 and 6 hit points, average of 3.5. Here's what its attack bonus is. Here's what's the damage is expected, save DC, and so on. And then the half of the screen you're seeing on the right is the data that I have compiled to the best of my ability for each CR, averaging out all of the 2024 edition monsters found in the 2025 monster manual. So here I'm averaging out all those creatures so you can see how they look, right? And we're going to get into some easier comparisons now, so don't try to blow your mind trying to gather it all together. But you can see what the kind of the way I approached it, right? With defensive statistics like the armor class and the hit points, offensive like the attack bonus, some things that weren't tracked in the DMG 2014, like what is the number of multi-attacks a monster tends to have. I also looked at the initiative bonus that is in there and a few other features that I looked at, whether they have resistances, vulnerabilities, immunities, things like that, which I'm going to have to look at in another video because I'm really curious about that vulnerability, resistances, immunities. I feel like there are a lot more resistance and immunities, but maybe I'm wrong. So I want to crunch some numbers. So I pulled together this big table like this, and now let me kind of break it down a little more. And I should also say, I compared this in addition to the published data we have via Blog of Holding, and I'll look at Tom Dunn's as well, but the Blog of Holding data shows what published monsters look like, right? So not just the 2014 DMG guidelines, but actual monsters that are in your books, what's their average? And so I compared to that. And lastly, I looked at the gorgeous Forge of Foes and the tables that we provide there for guidance to see how that compares. All right, so here we are comparing in a little more easy to see way the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide guidance. It's the same chart we saw before, but I've kind of put things next to each other, and the 2025 Monster Manual for the 2024 edition. So you can see here by CR. So each CR is here in this first column. And then we have what did it tell us in the DMG that the data should look like. So for example, CR4, a monster should have an AC of 14. So what does it look like with the average of all CR4 monsters in the 2024 edition Monster Manual? Well, 14.5. So it's a tiny bit above that average. What I would say is generally these numbers, where you see them in black ink, it means that the number was either above it or pretty darn close to it, enough that I wouldn't be bothered at all. And arbitrarily, I did this. I just kind of went through and flagged it. So in some cases, we can say, oh, it's pretty close anyway. But when it was lower, then I put it in red. It may not be substantially. 12.5 still rounds up to 13. So this is what I mean, that, maybe this one should be in black ink. I don't know. It's hard to say, but you can see some variance where it's lower. Lower doesn't mean bad necessarily. In fact, if you saw my previous video, one of the questions I asked myself is, have they made any sea change in their approach, right? Have they decided, for example, that in 2024, the monsters should be super easy to hit, but hit you much harder, right? So they fade away quickly, but they dealt damage to you, and battle is faster. That's something that 4th edition experimented with halfway through their edition with the Dark Sun campaign guide for 4th edition, and it was great. It made for really fun battles that kind of hit you hard, but then wrapped up faster. So you will see from the data here, I don't think they've really done that in any significant way, mostly. And we'll have to go through a couple of these screens to kind of really get to that. But if you look at this, you can see, in general, the numbers look pretty true, right? They're not hugely above the numbers for armor class, and they are only sometimes below. And that could just be these particular monsters, right? So any monster, when you're designing it, you might say, well, I'm going to go exactly with the armor class it should be, right? Or you might say, I want to go a little harder because that fits the concept of the monster. It is, I don't know, a giant. It's super easy to hit, so I'm going to go with a lower armor class, right? Or I might say this thing is a Behir that has big plates, and so it's hard to crack through its armor. So you might go up or down based on the concept, and then you compensate for it somewhere else. Like it's really hard to hit, but it does less damage, right? And so you just may have hit a certain number of these monsters that trigger this. And important thing that I looked at in my data is the sample size. And so all of these tables have a place where I show the sample size. Here it's this last column. And sometimes I only have, 7 or 1 or 4 monsters. And so it becomes really hard to say for sure, what the data should be like. Again, if we had if the 2024 DMG had told us, that would really have been helpful. But yeah, so armor class, I don't see a major sea change here. It gets a little higher at the highest CRs compared to their old statistics, but this is not the only way to look at this. So let's not take too much. I'll say let's wait till we look at the published monsters, and you can draw full impressions there. The hit point range, again, this I found to be, so what I did is I took the lowest hit points that were available in that CR and the highest that appear in the book, right? So in the 2025 Monster Manual for CR4, there was a monster that had 40, and there was a monster that had 120, and then a bunch in between that had other numbers, right? What I instead looked at was the average hit points a little more closely. I added that because it's interesting. But more important, more telling is the average hit points. And here you can see that actually a lot of these are lower than the 2014 DMG guidance. Again, there'll be more to this story, but you can see really all of these are below that number. But we'll look at the published numbers. Attack bonus was pretty reasonable here, generally higher than what the DMG told us to do in 2014. The average damage in general was pretty good. You can see just a couple of red numbers there where it really differs in terms of what you'd expect. And often these red numbers are if we assume 2 targets versus more. I will say one of my impressions is that more monsters in 2025 tend to have AoE. which can drive that difference between these two columns. And that difference can sometimes be significant, right? Difference between 140 or 117 damage in a round, that can start adding up. And sometimes it's very significant, 393 versus 240. So, it can matter whether you're getting 2 targets or not. At some levels, it doesn't matter at all because they're exactly the same. Saving throws, sometimes they were a little lower, but not tremendously so. And again, this is for the guidance versus the published. And then I just have our tables, there's no comparison here because I don't have 2014. This wasn't something I recommended, so I just added it there as a thing that I tracked. But let's look at how this compares to published monsters. So this is published monsters in the 2014 Monster Manual, in Volo's Guide to Monsters, in Mordenkainen's Fantastic Foes. So before the giant multiverse book came out that revised Volo's and Mordenkainen's monsters. And here we're going to see, I think to me this is a little more telling. The DMG advice is good, but here we get into what was actually in your printed books, what was actually at your table. And we can see that the number of red items kind of drops. Or not kind of, it drops. So AC, we really only have these 3 here that are lower than what they were. And looking at the numbers, they're still pretty close. And most of these are really very close, right? The difference between 16.7 and 16 is probably just down to 1 or 2 monsters that factored it one way or the other. These are all really close. So I would say, looking at this, for 2025, AC has not changed drastically. Has average hit points? No, not really either. They're a little lower in a couple of the levels, which that may be okay. CR4 is a little lower, but we also see things that are higher, right? 9 higher for CR5, 15 higher. And so if anything, what I'm seeing is a number of these are slightly higher than before. Sometimes with enough that would make a difference, right? It might be an extra blow it can take in combat. There are a few cases where it drops down, but that could be due to the sample size, right? This is next to last column, the number of monsters. Those 4 monsters maybe went really low. The best example is CR18. There's only a single monster, and it only has 180 hit points. So it's way lower than the 270 average for all published monsters through Mordenkainen's. And then bigger at other areas, right? So you can see these high CRs, the examples that we were given of, a few monsters between 1 and 5 monsters, they tend to be stronger, sometimes substantially stronger in hit points than before. Does that reflect an absolute goal at the wizard side? Hard to say, but you can see that if anything, hit points went up overall. At higher CRs, the presence seems a little stronger, but it's spotty. Attack bonus is kind of similar. We can see that it's often really close. And there are sometimes variances within a stat block. So a monster might hit a little better with one attack versus another. So I didn't track that. I just went for the best option that's there. You can see a few items in red where it dips down, but when it dips down in red, it's not substantial. I also don't see enormous increases beyond what we expected. It's nice to see a little uptick that's stronger at the higher levels, but it's really actually very close. So I don't think attack bonus changed at all as a paradigm in 2025 for the 2024 rules. The damage per round here, you can see no red at all, right? So it's interesting to look at like the DMG comparison. We had a lot of red here when you look to what the guidelines are. When you look to what's been published, nothing deals less damage on average for the CR of all the monsters in the 2025 Monster Manual. In the opposite, you'll see these items in bold because these stuck out to me, where when I look at the 2 target average DPR, those are stronger. So even if we just say 2 things are getting hit in an AoE, so after CR6, you can see that if I look at the damage in column L, so column L is our damage in published monsters, and we skip this middle one, which is where you hit a larger number of targets, and we just look to 2 targets. Just on 2 targets alone, you can see nice increases from 40 damage per round for CR8 to 57 for CR8 in the new book, from 45 to 58, from 60 to 93, 94, right? It doesn't always, it's not a linear change, right? You can see sometimes the gap the difference is different. Like in fact, look at CR15 and 16, 120 to 121. They're both much higher, but it wasn't by, a linear increase, right? It wasn't like they said, oh, add X to every monster. But you can see the numbers have gone up. The damage being dealt is way higher after CR6. And you even see a little bit of it before that. And in no case are they dealing lower damage. Now, if you go to column M and you say, let's assume you are hitting more than 2 targets in your multi-attacks, now the numbers get even bigger and they do it sooner. You can see a stronger effect here. And the numbers become really big with these monsters that can really deal a lot of AoE. So you'll see some of these where the difference here starts becoming really significant, right? When you're dealing, not always, like this must be, there's just a single monster, so it probably doesn't have AoE. But when you have a number of monsters that are using a lot of AoE, which some of these higher CRs do, then that 3-round average becomes a lot stronger if you assume more targets. Here's a giant one. So CR22, there are 4 monsters, and for those 4 monsters, the difference is between 240 a round and 394 a round for the damage that they deal, if you assume you can get more than 2 targets in AoE based on that table I shared earlier. Wow. Okay, so I find this very fascinating, right? They said they wanted to make monsters hit harder, and compared to their previously published monsters, yes. I will say, now, some of us have been arguing that actually the damage should look a lot like where the DMG is, and that's where some of these are okay, or they're catching up, essentially. So it's better. It's an improvement, but they didn't, say, blow away what a lot of us have been advocating for. They didn't go beyond that. And I'll get more on that in a second. So saving throws, by and large, pretty similar. Even when they dip down, it's just by like a point. So that could, again, be just a monster concept issue. So saving throws, I don't see any big changes to their logic. And I should say, this is me doing my best job at this. If you look at these numbers and you see some other thoughts, let me know. I love talking about this. I always appreciate when folks have different views. These last 3 are just things that I added. Again, the multi-attacks initiative and the number of monsters that I have. So nothing to compare against there. It's just my own view there. Last look is the awesome Forge of Foes. So for Forge of Foes, we did a number of really fun things. So you can go in this book and you can see things like we look at what's the equivalent character level for this CR. We do things like look at in a multi-attack, what is the average damage? What do we think how many attacks you should do as a multi-attack? And it tends to be more than the published ones. And for that multi-attack, what should each below deal? So there are a lot of neat things in these tables you'll get. We also do things like say, if you want a hard fight with 2 bosses and a bunch of little guys, what's that fight look like? And so you can look at that and easily put together your encounters. But I wanted to see sort of how it looks against our recommendations, the 24-25 data, the 2024 edition, against Forge of Foes. And you can see that they are actually often doing a little more and sometimes lower. So it varies, but it's pretty close. There is a C average hit points. There are a couple where they go under what we would recommend. So CR4, for example, substantially lower. Sometimes they're a little higher, though not generally by a big amount. You see a few cases where they start getting higher. And their own numbers are interesting. Sometimes they'll go up and down. It's not, again, fully linear, and some of that depends on the sample size we have to work with. But you can see here, pretty close. They were way low on hit points for the CR18 example that I mentioned before. But pretty good. Their Tarask is 697 hit points versus the 666 guideline that we have. Then attack bonus. Also, they're a little lower in just a couple places. Sometimes they go higher, 2 higher here, but pretty close. Damage per round, there are a few dips, but then we see some bolds where they've gone higher than what we do. So we recommended, for example, 83 for CR13, and they hit 95, or 89 for CR15, they hit 116. So that's where it'll be really fascinating to see where these monsters are hitting substantially harder than we would have expected and than they have in the past. How does that compensate for the other parts of that challenge intersection that I talked about, right? The characters have changed, the encounter tables have changed. So it'll be very interesting to see. So there are some big differences in the damage that's out there, especially if you then go to the larger number of attacks with AoE. So those of you who are really cunning DMs and you're going to drop 2 fireballs in the entire party, well, you may want to look at that and can reconsider your guidance a bit, or what monsters you add in based on that. Then the multi-attack numbers. So this is the number of attacks that I calculated from the 25 data, 25 monster manual against Forge of Foes. And here we see there are some differences in terms of how many they do. We at Forge of Foes like averaging out that math. And when you have a bunch of attacks, it both feels dynamic. You're doing cool stuff. They are feeling threatened, more chances to get hurt, but also the math levels out, right? There are more chances. If I roll once, that 20-sided die can go any way we want. But as I roll more 20-sided dice, I get a little more of a stable bell curve result. So we tend to advocate more than they do. So I didn't really put these in red. This is just our philosophy at work. Our recommendations when you're creating monsters. Saving throw DCs, they tend to be a little lower than what we advocate. That Tarask having a saving throw of 20. And we would have said make those 27 because a lot of your characters will resist those or have ways to get past it and play because they're so much stronger. So having the monsters saving throws be a little harder can make for better battles, especially when there's so many times they may not get their spells off or other situations like that. So that's it. So we looked at the Forge of Foes, the published from the blog of Holding, and the DMG comparison. I want to look at Tom Dunn's numbers as well, but I'll do that in working with him, which will be really fun because Tom's such a genius at math. So let's look at a couple of examples to kind of give this a tangible feel. All right, so let's talk about a couple of examples so you get a feel for what this DPR looks like at a tangible level. And here is a Remorhaz mini, one of my favorite monsters. Remorhaz is just fantastic. There's really sweet art, the Remorhaz chasing down penguins. Yeah, it's actually pretty cool. I can't show you the pages of the book. We're not allowed to share our watermarked PDF. If you want to see things that we can talk about that you can look at, take a look at the most recent Mastering Dungeons episodes. There we broke down the previews that are already publicly available and our show notes for those who are Patreon subscribers. You can see those and see those examples in there because they were already shared. But I can only tell you about the information. I can't share my screen until the physical book arrives, which it hasn't yet. The Remorhaz, again, has a young version and the adult. And when we look at the actual huge monstrosity, it has an armor class of 17, 195 hit points, plus 5 initiative. And so that, for a CR11 creature, it has a slightly higher armor class than it would. Its hit points are higher than what you would expect for 2014 monsters. The average for published is 165. It's at 195. So it's got a little more armor class, a little more hit points. Initiative is plus 5, which is pretty decent for monsters. It is immune to cold and fire. So damage-wise, it does 84 damage around the way I calculated. It doesn't deal AoE, so I didn't need to worry about number of targets in comparing it. The average for CR11 is about 97 to 80, depending whether you look at multi-targets. So 98 to 80 is sort of the average that we're seeing. So this actually does a little less damage, which is interesting because the Remorhaz used to be a super, super effective monster. So why has it changed a bit? Well, so it actually is kind of a neat redesign that they've done. It has a heat aura. So at the end of each of its turns, and that's not done on the character's turns, on its turns, each creature in a 5-foot emanation around it takes 16 fire damage. So, the more characters that are crowding around, it's taking damage. That's a big redesign. What used to happen is that when you touched it, including a punch, or hit it and you were 5 feet away from it, you would take damage. This is very big for its damage, right? Because if you think of a monk that would flurry, they would take multiple instances of a smaller amount of damage, but they would take it multiple times. And a fighter with lots of multi-attacks who might want to action surge, well, that would be very painful exchange. And if I look at the Remorhaz, which I have on my other screen, that it used to take, you would take 10 damage every time you hit it. So now, it doesn't matter how many times you hit it, at the end of the Remorhaz's turn, you'd take 16, which also means you could hit it and move away, possibly, especially if you have some way to avoid attacks of opportunity, or if someone already triggered it, or you canceled their reactions. So very different interplay here, which on the whole will lower the damage the Remorhaz deals. I loved monsters that deal damage when you hit them, because I can have the worst day at rolling and you're still taking damage, and it creates a trade-off. I like that. So I miss this, but I also appreciate the beauty of what they're trying to do here and streamlining that so you're not punishing the monk or the fighter compared to somebody else. Now, the bite deals 8 plus 14 damage, so that's 32 total. Our old attack was 40 plus 10, so it was 50. So it has gone substantially down on its bite. Now, when you are bitten, you are automatically grappled. There's no check at all, which was also the case before, and the escape DC is the same. So you're restrained, you're grappled, and now what has changed is that before, there was an action called swallow. So one round, I bite you and I deal 50 damage. Now you're grappled. Next round, I would swallow you. That was the 2014 way. And the swallow, you would then take 21 damage at the start of each of the Remorhaz's turns. Now the way it works is I bite and I grapple you. So I dealt less damage with a bite, but I have a bonus action to swallow. And here, I bring you into my, if you don't make the saving throw of DC 19, you are inside my gullet. You are being processed inside this thing, and you'll take 20 acid and fire damage. So pretty similar, just a point less. So they've moved the damage around, right? And that's what makes it so interesting. When you say, is the Remorhaz stronger or weaker? Well, I think it actually has not changed in armor class or hit points or other defensive qualities, but the heat aura will vary greatly depending on the party. The ability to swallow on the exact same round is a big boon because now that creature is inside and is restrained and has to deal with that all in that one turn. So it might be a slight trade-off on damage, but I think this is a monster that got better because of the approach. Another similar creature is the purple worm. This thing, I love this gorgeous mini, and the art actually looks a little bit like this guy, really nice. The purple worm, which is, this gargantuan monstrosity, it is a monster that now has a bonus action swallow as well. And so a big question is, how many things can you swallow? If you can get enough of the party into your gullet, that's a big deal and will lead to a big amount of damage and qualifies as defense, right? Because it's harder for them to do damage inside. They can't heal each other. They're taking automatic damage that you don't have to roll against while you're out there biting and tail stinging the things that are outside. So that is a monster that will vary greatly, just like the Remorhaz. Let's talk about the Frost Giant. Giants have changed a fair amount, and they were on my list of things that I would like to change for flavor. So what I found was the old Giant. If I look at the old 2014 Frost Giant, this guy makes 2 great axe attacks and deals 25 damage with each, and then has the ability to throw a rock. And I find that incredibly boring because this is a giant covered in frost. Like, there should be something that tells you about that. In addition to, if you're just hitting 25 damage, like a lot of things can deal 25 damage. What makes that a giant, right? Big improvements have happened here while looking at the DPR of things. So the multi-attack is still there, 2 attacks, but now I can do axe or great bow. So we've switched the rock for a great bow. Okay, fine. The axe is more effective. It deals 19 slashing and 9 cold. So you get a little flavor in there. It's not just axe damage, it's cold. It's a frost axe. So 28 damage there. Before it was 25, so we got a little more damage. We're getting a total of 6 more damage per round. on the 2 attacks. If you use your great bow, it deals a little less damage. It's instead of 28, it is 24. Still also includes cold damage. And you decrease the speed by 10 feet, giving you that feeling of the numbing cold. So that's kind of cool. Nice trade-off. A little bit of damage down, but you get a condition. And we get a bonus action of a war cry. Recharge 5 to 6, and you can give yourself temp hit points and advantage on attack rolls until the start of the next turn, or an ally, you can do that to them. So cool. The Frost Giant gets this sort of like, yeah, everybody's on the ship together kind of working mentality, that sort of nature they have, the aspect. Nice way of representing it. The damage gets a little increase and it becomes more level, right? More ways to do the damage that you want and deal with situations appropriately. It's not as far as I would like, and that when I think of giants that are that huge, I think they should be able to stomp the ground and knock you prone, push you out, right? It didn't go that far. If you've seen the preview talking about the hill giant does things like throw trash or attack you with its weapon, and its weapon is also sort of flavored to sort of represent, why is this giant just carrying around trash to throw? I don't know, but it at least does create a little story. And while might not give you that sense of a real giant, it's overall pretty effective and pretty nice. Oh, and if I look at the list of my CR8 monsters, which is what the Frost Giant is, so it deals an average of 56 damage per round. That puts it a little below the average that's out there. So 57, so pretty much on the nose for 2 target. But if we include multi-targets, AoE that can hit more than 2 targets, then it's 63 is my average. So we should say by their design goals, it's right on track. The Frost Giant is dealing what you'd expect that it would do. If I look at historic levels and I look at published monsters for a CR8, I would expect the damage to be around 63.9. So it's a little bit under that. And our Forge of Foes recommendation for CR8, it is just around what we would recommend in Forge of Foes. So let's talk about this Fire Elemental, which is another example of kind of interesting features and a monster that I think is really neat. I want it to hit hard. It is burning fire as a thing. It should be really awesome. When I look at my spreadsheet in 2025, it's doing an average DPR of 45 or 40 if you think of just 2 targets. And that compares well to the CR5 average of 2025. The average is around 37. So this is dealing about another 8 points of damage per round more than one would expect. If I look at my Forge of Foes guidance for CR5, we would expect the damage to be around 35. So it is doing nicely for that, right? They have actually picked up the pace on dealing that damage very well. And above that, the average for what the monster manual is doing. So let's take a look at what the Fire Elemental itself does. And what makes it interesting is it, in 2000, if I look at the old version, it had the ability to deal damage when you hit it. So kind of like I was talking about before with the Remorhaz. If you hit it with a mid attack, you take 5 fire damage, and the elemental can stop in your space and give you 5 fire damage. And you are then burning, and you track that 5 fire damage into later rounds. So it was a lot of things to sort of track that could add up into big damage numbers if. And then it had a multi-attack to do 2 touch attacks, each doing 10 points of damage and setting you on fire. So how does it work now? We have a fire aura. At the end of the elemental's turns, each creature in a 10-foot emanation, so big area, is taking 5 fire damage, and you start burning. So we do still have this burning, which is a condition now in the game. It can enter a creature's space, and the first time it does that, you take 5 fire damage, but it is for the fire elemental moving through you. So at least it's easier to track. It also doesn't create burning on that, so that's nice. We've made it fewer things to track, but it's moving at a speed of 50, so it can actually probably go through the entire party and deal 5 damage to everybody, which is kind of a neat thing. And then wherever it parks itself, that will be the fire aura in 10 feet, dealing 5 out there. The multi-attack is 2 burn attacks, which do 10 fire damage, which was the same as before. And you are now burning, so we just used that burning rule from before. So it's pretty similar, but a little streamlined. It has fewer hit points than it did before. It has... it's one of the few monsters that has a vulnerability, but it doesn't have it as a vulnerability. It has it as water susceptibility, which is interesting. So that's a fun thing that sort of changed from before. But overall, a monster that hits pretty hard and tactically could really be hard to figure out, right? You might be super effective at moving around through everybody's squares and dealing damage to the entire party, especially if you're in a small area. So very interesting monster. All right. At this point, I've got to get back to doing my day job. I've been trying to put these videos out in between everything else. So I hope you enjoyed this. It's been a long video looking at a lot of both examples and the overall damage in the game. I hope you find this fascinating. Folks who make this possible are the people in my Patreon and in the Mastering Dungeons Patrons who support the work that we do. Thank you for that. If you can, please consider joining the Patreon. But if you can't, that's okay. The biggest thing you can do to help me is share these videos, interact with them, tell people about them. Don't just click a like when you see it on social media. Actually write out there about it. Share the link, repost things so that more people are seeing it. Tell your friends, tell the people you game with. That helps me when new people are watching my channel. That's one of the biggest things you can do to help me. And so I really appreciate it. I hope this video has been fun. If you are on my Patreon, very soon I'll be able to provide the actual breakdown data to share it with you so you can see that as part of the adventure design tools. And I look forward to the next time talking about monsters on this channel.